Some people don't notice the early signs of exhaustion because nothing dramatic happens at first. The mind simply becomes quieter, less reactive, more distant from itself. Maybe this sounds familiar. When the internal load has been heavy for too long, the system begins turning down emotional signals to conserve what's left, not as a message or a lesson, just a quiet response to a pressure that has been present for years. In many situations, emotional shutdown appears only after a long period of silent effort. It's not about giving up, and it's not a failure of strength. It's the result of a mind that has been carrying too much for too long, without enough room to process any of it. Before numbness arrives, there are months or years of internal adjustments, managing thoughts carefully, controlling reactions, staying easy for others, holding discomfort without expressing it, and anticipating outcomes that may never happen. Over time, these habits take more energy than the person realizes. The emotional system starts falling behind, feelings arrive late, muted, or incomplete. Insight becomes heavier instead of helpful. Social interactions feel like tasks instead of connection. Nothing looks extreme from the outside, but inside, the system is draining. This pattern isn't intentional. It's a natural response from a mind that has learned to prioritize stability over expression, and when the load becomes too high, the mind quietly dims itself to survive. Certain minds reach a point of shutdown, not because a single event was overwhelming, but because the internal effort has been running non-stop for too long. Before any visible sign appears on the outside, there is usually a long phase of quiet management happening underneath. Maybe this sounds familiar. A person like this often spends days, weeks, or months holding together responsibilities, reactions, and expectations with a level of precision no one around them notices. The tension begins early in the day, sometimes before anything has actually gone wrong. Their attention goes straight to what needs to be handled, what could go off track, what demands extra care. None of this looks dramatic from the outside. It's just a steady mental pressure they've grown used to. They track their tone, their timing, their presence in a room. They monitor what they're saying and how it might land. And even when there's nothing urgent to solve, the mind stays activated, scanning for the next thing that might need control. Over time, this becomes less about choice and more about habit. The constant internal checking turns into an automatic process that never fully stops. You might recognize something here. Instead of allowing emotions to rise naturally, the mind pushes them aside so it can keep functioning. Instead of slowing down, it accelerates its own vigilance. The effort is invisible, but the cost accumulates quietly. What eventually feels like numbness often starts as sheer depletion. The system is still doing the work, but the energy behind it is gone. So it begins turning down emotional signals to conserve what's left. Not because the person doesn't care, and not because they're disconnected from life, but because the mental load has exceeded what the mind can keep carrying with the same intensity. The shutdown doesn't appear suddenly. It arrives as the final stage of an overload that was happening in silence. And for many people, this internal quiet is the only way their mind knows how to keep going when it has already given more than it had. Some people move through the world with an unusual level of caution about how much space they take. Long before they feel the weight of shutdown, there's already a quiet rule running in the background. Don't bother anyone. Don't create tension. Don't become a source of extra work. This isn't a conscious choice most of the time. It's a habit learned slowly. often in environments where being easy to handle felt safer than being fully seen. Maybe this sounds familiar. In daily life, this shows up subtly. They answer in a way that keeps conversations smooth. They downplay their needs so no one feels pressured. They carry emotional discomfort internally because expressing it feels like a risk. Nothing about this looks unhealthy on the surface. In fact, many people around them might see them as stable, patient, or even selfless. But underneath, every interaction requires a small adjustment, a slight holding back, a quiet editing of themselves. The social filter becomes heavier when they're already tired. Even a simple request, meeting up, replying to a message, showing interest, can feel like another obligation to manage gracefully. And when someone asks how they're doing, the automatic answer appears, "I'm fine." Not because they're hiding something dramatic, but because explaining the truth feels like a form of inconvenience. You might recognize yourself in this part. If any part of this feels familiar, some people find it grounding to name which detail resonates with them. It often shows how common this quiet pattern actually is. As the pressure adds up, the filter starts shaping their emotions too. When expressing discomfort feels like taking space, the mind eventually stops sending those signals with clarity. It's easier to mute them than to risk appearing demanding. So emotions soften, flatten, or disappear entirely. Not out of apathy, but out of repeated self-restriction. By the time shutdown appears, it's not a sudden collapse. It's the result of years spent minimizing needs to remain manageable to others. The mind simply mirrors the habit. If taking space was unsafe, feeling too much becomes unsafe too. In many situations, a person who has lived under constant internal pressure develops another quiet habit. They monitor themselves before they even react. The mind performs a quick scan, checking tone, posture, expression, and timing. None of this is visible to others. It happens in fractions of a second, long before any word is spoken. Maybe this sounds familiar. The goal isn't perfection. It's avoiding anything that might create tension or misunderstanding. This kind of monitoring begins early in life for many people, when emotional reactions were met with confusion, irritation, or inconsistency. The mind learned to pre-correct. Over time, it becomes automatic. Even simple interactions, answering a question, expressing a preference, declining an invitation, pass through an internal filter. The person tries to ensure that whatever comes out is acceptable, predictable, and uncomplicated for others. As the years pass, this habit becomes exhausting. Every conversation requires micro-adjustments. Every emotion needs to be checked before being felt. The person measures how loud they laugh, how sad they look, how uncertain they sound. And because the process is so constant, they don't even notice how much energy it consumes. Some people pause when they hear this. At a certain point, the monitoring starts affecting the emotional system itself. When you spend long enough softening reactions, the mind eventually softens the feeling behind them too. Not to hide anything, but to reduce the effort involved. It becomes easier to stay neutral than to manage the complexity of showing anything real. What looks like numbness is often the result of years spent shaping the self into something digestible for everyone else. If you notice yourself in this description, it can be interesting to observe which moment feels the closest. That simple act of naming it often reveals you're not the only one moving through life like this. By the time shutdown appears, the monitoring system has already been running far beyond capacity. Emotions don't disappear suddenly. They fade because the mind has been pre-editing them for so long that feeling becomes another task, another point of potential overwhelm. There's a quiet pattern that appears when someone has spent years managing more than they can process in real time. Emotions start arriving late, not because the person is disconnected from themselves, but because the mind has been prioritizing stability over immediacy for far too long. Maybe this sounds familiar. Instead of feeling things as they happen, the system files experiences away to be dealt with later when there's more internal space. Except that later rarely comes. In daily life, this delay shows up in small and confusing ways. A difficult conversation seems fine in the moment, but hours afterward, something tightens. An uncomfortable comment goes unnoticed until days later, when it suddenly returns with weight. Even positive moments feel muted. The mind registers what happened, but the emotional response arrives softened, distant, incomplete. Nothing dramatic, just a slow drift between the experience and the feeling. For someone living like this, the delay becomes a form of protection. Emotional processing requires attention, energy, and room to breathe. But when the mind is busy holding everything else together, monitoring behavior, preventing conflict, managing social pressure, there isn't enough capacity left. So it postpones the emotional load, hoping that later will be safer, calmer, or less overwhelming. Over time, this postponing becomes habitual. The system stops expecting immediate understanding of what it feels. It adapts by reducing intensity first, then reducing clarity. That's why many people in shutdown describe a sense of being present, but dimmed. The mind hasn't stopped feeling. It has simply stopped trying to feel in real time. This delay also contributes to the sense of detachment, often mistaken for indifference. It's not a lack of emotion, it's a lack of immediate access to emotion. And when that gap grows, it becomes difficult to trust one's own internal signals. The person starts questioning whether they're overreacting, underreacting, or missing something entirely. By the time emotional shutdown sets in, the delay is accumulated across hundreds of moments. The mind isn't empty. It's backed up. It has more stored than it can process, and no remaining capacity to keep up. People who move through life with a high level of internal awareness often pay a price for it. Before emotions settle, before situations unfold, their mind is already noticing small shifts. Tone, timing, hesitation, tension. Nothing mystical, just a long-practiced sensitivity. In many situations, this awareness helps them navigate quietly and avoid unnecessary conflict. But it also creates a steady internal pressure that rarely lets them rest. Maybe this sounds familiar. Insight, when it comes early and often, requires energy. The mind collects details others overlook. It anticipates reactions before they happen. It interprets subtle changes in people's behavior almost automatically. On the outside, this can look like emotional intelligence or maturity. On the inside, it's another source of constant load. The person isn't choosing to analyze anything. Their mind simply doesn't know how to turn that part off. Over time, this continuous awareness becomes tiring in a different way than social filtering or self-monitoring. It's not about pleasing others or staying controlled. It's about carrying information the system doesn't have room to process. The mind sees too much, predicts too much, understands too much. And because of that, it feels responsible for managing more than it can handle. Some people pause when they hear this. As the insight grows, so does the internal demand. The person feels compelled to adjust themselves for situations that haven't even happened. They prepare for emotional consequences that never come. They anticipate disappointment or conflict that may not exist. It's not catastrophizing, it's over-awareness, and the mind becomes tired from holding predictions it cannot release. When this pattern continues for years, insight stops feeling like clarity and becomes another weight. It turns into a kind of internal saturation. The person knows so much so early that their emotional system never gets the chance to respond naturally. Everything is filtered through expectation, interpretation, and preparation. By the time shutdown appears, the cost of insight has already drained the last reserves. The exhaustion isn't sudden. It's the result of carrying more understanding than the emotional system can process. Some people reach a point of emotional shutdown, not because they stopped caring, but because their mind has been working far beyond its capacity for too long. The signs rarely look dramatic. They appear slowly in the background. The constant mental load, the pressure to stay manageable, the habit of self-monitoring, the delayed emotional responses, and the weight of noticing more than they can process. None of these patterns feel extreme on their own, but together they create a steady internal drain that eventually leaves the system with no energy left for feeling. This kind of shutdown is quiet. It doesn't look like collapse. It looks like someone who still does what they need to do, still shows up, still functions, just with less color, less immediacy, less access to themselves. The emotional signals don't disappear. They dim. They become distant, slow, or muted, because the mind has shifted its priority from expression to survival. There's no dramatic turning point. The shutdown is simply the final stage of a long attempt to stay balanced while carrying too much. And when it finally arrives, it reveals not weakness, but the accumulated cost of years spent managing life internally in ways no one around them ever truly saw.